Hello and welcome to my Asia and Pacific Fires Talk. Today the topic is China's in the space industry in 2021 and my guest is Deville, who is an aerospace engineering graduate from ISAE Superior Institute of Aeronautics and Space in France. He is co-founder of Dongfang Hour, an independent media which covers the latest developments of the Chinese space industry and its increasing role in international space ecosystem. He is currently based in Paris and was previously based in Shenzhen, China. Jin speaks fluent Mandarin, and he spent over 12 years in mainland China and Taiwan. Hi, Jin. Thank you for joining me today. I'm very much excited to having you today. I do really.
Thanks for having me, Lokman. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. I do really want to us to talk about tell us please little about the China space history, how China got to the point where it is now.
So yeah, that's a very good question, and it's an opportunity to put a little bit of context around our discussion today. So more as a fun fact, if we talk about space history, if we talk about rocket history in more rudimentary terms, actually we can go back hundreds of years. That may seem unbelievable. Like already around the 12th and 13th century, it seems that the Chinese were using gunpowder, which is something that they had invented, as a means of propulsion for explosive arrows. And by doing that, that shows some form of understanding of the aerodynamics of elongated objects. And it's not a coincidence, by the way, that rocket in Chinese is called 火箭. 火箭 means fire arrow. And so you can see that there's this historical background to the idea of rocket. Now, of course, we're not talking about explosive arrows today. We're talking about actual putting objects into orbit, right? Like the modern space industry. And so if we were talking about putting things into orbit, then we probably have to go back to the 1950s. And so that's when basically China started to get interested in the space industry. And similarly to other countries, China was interested in the space industry for one reason in particular, which was to develop ballistic missiles. Because in 1950s, major powers were developing the nuclear bomb, and you needed a way to deliver this bomb to enemy territory. And the traditional way of doing that is maybe using an airplane, right? A bomber. So you drop bombs on enemy territory. But anti-aircraft systems were becoming more and more sophisticated. And so using airplanes was not a reliable way. So the best way was the ballistic missile. The ballistic missile is basically a rocket that goes up and then down again on enemy territory. And so that was the main interest for China in the 1950s. There were, of course, other reasons of being interested in space that would come later, also military applications, such as Earth observation satellites to be able to spy on your enemy territory. There's also satellite navigation. There are many mentions of the space industry, but that's basically how it started. And if maybe to put a little context on how this was actually done. So in the 1950s, China and a lot of major powers did the same thing. The idea was to take the German V2 rocket that the Germans had designed during World War II, to copy it and to improve it. And that was the very first missiles. The Russians did the same. And so the Chinese did just that. And that gave birth to the Dongfang series of ballistic missiles, Dongfang 1, Dongfang 2, Dongfang 3, and Dongfang 4. And almost every country also that has a space industry did the same thing. Basically, they made ballistic missiles, and then one day they sort of thought, ballistic missile and a rocket are very similar. Maybe we can take our ballistic missiles and turn them into rockets for maybe civil purposes. And so that's exactly what China did. And they derived their Dongfang ballistic missile into a rocket called the Long March rocket. And so in 1970, China launched for the very first time its first rocket, the Long March 1, and on board was also its very first satellite called the Dongfang Hour 1. And so this happened on the 24th of April, 1970. It's really the symbol of China's early space history. And starting from that, so the 24th of April today in China is celebrated every year. It's called China Space Day. And so basically you have a lot of outreach events on the 24th of April all around the country where, we have, various activities explaining what astronomy, what space is to young people. And there's also one big main event that's in a different city every year. So that's the background for the Chinese space industry. I would also add that, well, after the 1970s, of course, China continued to develop various systems, making more sophisticated rockets, heavier satellite buses, various space sciences programs, et cetera, et cetera. And so it has grown to the state where it is today, where China is present in almost every subvertical of the space industry. And I guess we'll cover that also later in our discussion.
So, Jin, what does the industrial landscape look like in China, and who are the main players? Is everything defined, led by the government, or another industrial players?
So that's a very good question. So China has a legacy of planned economy, and so in the sense that so the space industry has almost is basically managed almost entirely by one single company, and this company is called CASC. It's China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, and this company is absolutely huge. It has over 100,000 employees, according to certain sources. It's 170,000. The way it's structured is basically it's composed of 8 different academies. So you have CASC at the top, and then you have 8 different academies, and each academy of CASC is focused on a number of subtopics. You have very specialized academies like the 6th Academy, which is called AALPT, the Aerospace Academy of Liquid Propulsion Technology. And so it's a very specialized, they only work on rocket engines. And then you have other academies like the Shanghai Academy of Science and Technology. And these guys, basically, they have activities in many, many subverticals. So they design rocket or parts of rockets, they design satellite buses, they design electronics, they really do a lot of things. And so 8 academies, and each academy is subdivided into a number of institutes that are spread all around the country. So you have hundreds and hundreds of institutes, and this is what makes, at the same time, you could have the impression that the Chinese space industry is simple, right? You only have one big company that is CASC, but actually it's subdivided into so many subsidiaries, institutes, that it makes it very complicated. And so this company, CASC, is directly beneath the MIIT. So it's the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. And it's also managed by SASAC. So SASAC is a commission in China that manages the most important state-owned enterprises in China. And so it sort of highlights the importance of CASC in China. So to put it in a nutshell, you have CASC, which is the main player in space by far. And you also have 2, 3, 4 other players in the space industry that are also state-owned. So you have CASIC, and CASIC, so China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation. CASIC is an industry that makes more military products, notably missiles, for example, but they also have relatively small compared to CASC. They have a civil space activities. So you have CASIC. You have also another company called CETC, so China Electronics Technology Corporation. And so they also have a wide variety of activities, and they are notably in the space industry, they are very strong, as in they are in charge of notably China's ground segment. A lot of the ground stations in China that are communicating with satellites are built by this company. And I think maybe the final 1 or 2 entities that I have to mention is the Chinese Academy of Sciences. So it's really this entity that has a very high number of research labs, and a number of them are focused on space technologies. And so the Chinese Academy of Sciences is responsible for doing space sciences, and also it takes potentially future space technologies and it matures them, and then it brings them into fruition by spinning off these technologies into potentially startups. So if we have to sum up the space industry to 4 or 5 companies, I would say it's, first of all, it's CASC to a large extent. And then there's these 4 state-owned enterprises or entities that play a big role. And then you also have a little bit the private sector, which plays a minor role, but also a growing role. But I think that is something that we'll probably get into further down the discussion.
One question about the end-to-end capability of China's space. Does China have end-to-end capabilities in space, or are they able to manufacture or to operate everything themselves?
So to a large extent, yes. To answer this question perhaps more extensively, we have to give a little historical perspective of how China manufactures its products, how it's sort of set up its space industry roadmap. And so basically in the 1980s and the 1990s, the Chinese space industry was growing extremely fast. It benefited from collaborations with a number of foreign companies that had active collaborations with China. And so some of them are like Alcatel, Hughes, Matra, MBB. And so China benefited definitely from this, but for various historical reasons, notably in the 90s, the US became increasingly suspicious of Chinese space activities. Notably, they accused China of using these collaborations to spy on Western technology and to use this spying for military purposes. And so this confrontation basically culminated in something that's called the Cox Report that was published by the United States in the late 1990s, in 1998. And basically, so officially accusing China of spying. And the result of this, the tangible results, is that satellites were then put on very strong export control. There's a regulation called ITAR, International Traffic in Arms Regulations. And so commercial satellites were then, communication satellites were then considered as military technology. And so it became very hard for any Western company that had an American component, a US component inside. So basically almost everybody, when we're talking about large systems, to export these systems to China. So China could no longer source its space products from abroad. It had to build them locally. And so this is one of the main reasons why China had no choice starting from the late 1990s, but to build everything by themselves. And so probably I would add that even if the events and the US suspicion in the 1990s had not taken place, I'm sure that China would have also pursued this autonomous policy of development in the space industry. Because China, we've seen it with telecoms, with other topics. China does not like to depend on foreign providers when we're talking about critical infrastructure. And so yeah, that's how China in the 2000s started to develop its own industry. And so they started making heavier satellite buses. And when we look at the results today, basically, they have rockets that cover the whole range of payloads to be launched. You have very light, small rockets like the Long March 6 or the Long March 11. You have much larger rockets like the Long March 5. You have very small nano satellites, small satellites, but they're also able to build massive geostationary communication satellites. You have a great variety of space sciences programs, Earth observation, meteorology, et cetera, satellite navigation. And so really today, China definitely has an end-to-end capability. And to some extent, it's due to this historical turn of events that we had in the 80s and that we also had in the 90s. And I think that this is what makes China the second space power, I think, today, in the sense that they're really able to cover the entire spectrum of space activities. And they also have the budget that's able to have ambitious plans behind each of these subverticals.
Jane, we are hearing a lot about SpaceX, Elon Musk, and do we have some similar phenomenon in China? What is the situation in China side?
So the answer to that is yes and no. Yes, because let me explain the yes and the no. So yes, because China has a private sector that's growing increasingly fast, and China is allowing the private sector also to play an increasingly important role. I said earlier that state-owned enterprises managed almost all of China's space industry, and to a large extent, this is true today. But starting from 2014, China enabled private capital, private money to invest into the space industry. And so this means that venture capital firms were able to invest early on was Earth observation, but it will also launch technology. And so today what we are seeing is this thriving ecosystem. There are dozens and dozens and more than 100 actually commercial startups today in China's space industry that are in almost every subvertical. You have startups in launch, you have startups building satellite buses, you have startups building various subsystems for satellites. You have startups that are using the data produced by these satellites to create services on the ground. So it's a really thriving ecosystem, although it is still early stage. So a lot of these, what I mean by early stage is basically a lot of these startups haven't started necessarily making money, so they're still living on VC money, or even some of the earlier stage ones, they don't even have a product that is commercialized yet. So a thriving ecosystem that grew starting from the opening policy in 2014. And I think that one of the reasons that China enabled this to happen is that, first of all, China likes to observe some of the policies that are done in the US. And so in the US, this commercial space trend, SpaceX and all that, this started much earlier. It started in the 2000s and probably even earlier than that. And so this movement of standardization, of using commercial off the shelf grade systems, this took place in the US, and we have a lot of success stories in the US. SpaceX, of course, as you mentioned, is one of the larger ones, but it's probably not the most representative, and you have a lot of other successful startups in the US. And so China likes to observe what the US is doing and to extract some of the good practices, some of the good policies, and to adapt it to local Chinese conditions. And I think this is one of the reasons why China allowed the private sector to play a larger role. Another reason is China has seen increasing success for its private companies over the past 20 years. You know, when we talk about companies notably in consumer electronics like Huawei, like Xiaomi, like DJI, like Lenovo, all of these companies are successful not only in China but also on an international stage. So it's really proof that commercial companies, private companies can play an important role and can be successful both within China and outside of China. I think when you combine those two factors, then I think this is one of the reasons why China is enabling a lot of private companies, the private sector, to play a role in space. Now, I also said, no, there is a difference with the US, and this difference is basically, there are several points that differentiate China from the US. And so the first one is that, for example, China's space program is entirely managed by state-owned enterprises. So by space program, I'm talking about the large civil space programs that, like, for example, the Gaofen Earth observation satellites, the state meteorology satellites, the satellite navigation satellites, the space exploration, for example, the lunar landers, the systems that are going to orbit and land on Mars. All of this is managed by state-owned enterprises exclusively, and we don't see any movement, any change so far of China subcontracting some of these tasks to the private sector. Okay, and in the US, this is a bit different. We've seen that NASA is happy to let a number of private companies take a growing role in sending astronauts to the International Space Station, to ship cargo to the International Space Station. We're seeing also NASA now, giving work to private companies in terms of designing a lunar lander. So the space program now, to some extent, is managed by some of these so-called new space companies, and SpaceX, of course, being the most important one here in the various programs that I mentioned. So I think that's the first point. The second point is that in China, there is it's interesting. China at the same time lets private companies play a role, but at the same time we see its state-owned enterprises compete sometimes directly with some of these private companies rather than. So to give a tangible example for your listeners, for example, let's take rockets, right? NASA today in the U.S. focuses on the very big rockets, the SLS, the big lunar rocket, and when we're talking about the much smaller rockets, what Rocket Lab is doing, or even the Falcon 9, well, NASA does not get involved in that. In China, it's quite the opposite. China, the state-owned enterprises are already involved in the very big rockets and the medium lift rockets, and so it's all the long march rockets. And the startups are building the very small rockets currently at the moment that put basically below 2 tons into a low Earth orbit. And what we're seeing is state-owned enterprises creating subsidiaries to compete directly with the private companies. So this is something that, it doesn't necessarily make sense, right? You're supporting the private sector, but then you're directly competing with them and with state-owned subsidiaries that have an extraordinary amount of funding. So I think there's a little bit of paradox here. I think one last point, and I'll hand it back over to you. So one last difference that we have between the US and China is that China has a lot of regulatory uncertainty. So when you're a private space company in China, it's not necessarily always clear what you can do and what you cannot do. And this is a problem in the space industry, because in the space industry, you have to invest money. And a lot of the programs are very long-term, right? If you want to design a rocket, it takes several years before your rocket is actually operational. So you need to have, this environment where you can basically foresee how things are going to go. And this regulatory uncertainty is definitely something that hampers the more CapEx-heavy long-term investments. And so this is something that you have in various applications of the space industry. So there's launch to some extent, there's communication satellites, there are other applications, the upstream applications where startups are not sure what they're allowed to do and not allowed to do. And this is different from the US, where basically I have the feeling that in the United States, if you don't have a law specifically saying that this is not allowed, basically you can go for it. In China, that it's best not to have that approach. So yeah, in a nutshell, again, to some extent, there's a resemblance. There's a strong new space ecosystem in China. It's still very early stage, however. Certain points put it on par with the US, for example, funding, and in other areas, it is still lagging behind and has quite some things to do to catch up.
Jane, regarding to the private companies, what role can private companies play? Where does the funding come from, or are these companies really private or no?
So, so about what companies can do.
Yes, what role can private companies play, or where does funding come from?
So I think it's, to answer this question, it's the easiest thing to do is probably to spell out certain sensitive verticals where private companies cannot go into, or at least they have a lot of restrictions. And let me list three major examples. And the first one is satellite communications, and especially broadband communications. This is a very sensitive infrastructure in China, and China wants state-owned enterprises to handle this. To give a little parallel with telecommunications, today, when we're talking about 3G, 4G, the infrastructure that's handling our mobile communications, you have three companies that are handling this. You have China Telecom, you have China Mobile, and you have China Unicom. And all of these are state-owned enterprises. Today, a private company in China cannot say, hey, I want to become a mobile operator, right? That just doesn't work that way. It's not allowed. It's critical infrastructure that has to be managed by state-owned enterprises. And so in the space industry, it seems that regarding broadband communications, it's going to be the same thing. So you've probably heard, our listeners have probably heard of Starlink, this massive constellation that SpaceX is planning to deploy. In China, we have a similar constellation called Guowang that's has not launched yet, but it's planned. And this will not be managed by a private company. It's not allowed. And China has put together over the now almost a year ago a company called China Satnet. It's also a private. It's a state-owned enterprise, and it'll be this company that will be handling China's broadband communication satellite constellation. So broadband satellite constellations, in terms of operating this constellation, this is closed to private companies. And we saw that early on, 4 or 5 years ago. So at the very premises of the Chinese new space wave, there were some companies that had plans for a broadband satellite constellation. And so typically an example is Galaxy Space. And these companies have withdrawn their plans because probably under the realization that they would not be allowed to do this. Anything that's upstream or downstream of this probably will be allowed. Building satellites for the constellation, for example, could be allowed, but not the operations. So that's the first example. Another example that I can give is space exploration. So typically, as mentioned, space exploration is really managed by, basically CNSA subcontracts these, basically all the different systems that are required for its various space exploration missions, such as the Chang'e lunar missions, the Mars missions, all the different experiments that are done in the Earth orbit. This is only done by state-owned enterprises. We have not seen in the past any moment where any of these tasks were subcontracted to a large extent to a private company. So space exploration, probably not a good idea for a private company in China. And probably the last sector that I want to mention here is launch. I sort of already mentioned it previously, but so China has a very big number of state-led space initiatives. So you have meteorology satellites, you have high-resolution Earth observation satellites, you have communication satellites, etc. All these satellites that are, national infrastructure, basically, these cannot be launched by private launch vehicles. So you can make a launch company in China. A private company can make a launch company, but it is very unlikely that the Chinese government will have the launch of these various satellites that I mentioned, done by a private company. It's always to generally these state-owned enterprises. This may change in the future, but yeah. So if you're a launch company in China, you're allowed to exist, but your market will probably come either from opportunities outside of China, either from commercial projects in China, but not state-led projects. And this is a very important distinction to make, because today, out of the 35, 40 launches that are done each year in China, almost all of them are done. The main payload is one of these state-led civil space program payloads. So yeah, I think those are the three big restrictions. And apart from that, I think that especially in the downstream part of in the very upstream part of the space industry, things are relatively open. So yeah, I think those three distinctions.
Jin, what is the role of the military in the Chinese space industry? Does the PLA has any role in growing Chinese space?
So, thank you for asking the question on the military. It is a question that comes up very often with when we're talking about Chinese space, right? And so China definitely has been the military definitely played an important role in China's space industry, just because a lot of systems in the space industry are dual use. So they can be used for civil purposes, but also for military purposes. And just to give a few examples, basically a ballistic missile and a rocket, they share quite a few common core technologies. Earth observation satellites, taking pictures or images of what's going on the ground. This can be used to map, for example, the distribution of crops in some area in the countryside. That's one possibility, but it can also be used to spy in enemy territory, right? So there are a lot of dual use applications. So naturally, just in any country, the space programs are often can very often be dual use. Space technologies can very often be dual use. So that's the first point I want to highlight. And it's the same in other countries. There is always a military component. The U.S. Under the Trump administration put together a space force. France as well has put together basically a space military entity. So this is a general trend we're seeing. So in China, it's no different. And in China, maybe sometimes we can have the impression that everything is dominated by the military. But I don't think that is a correct perception. But let me just dig a little bit into that. So I think one of the reasons why some observers have the impression that it's really military dominated is because just China is less open in terms of communications. In the U.S., I always take the U.S. as an example because they're the other big space superpower. And in the U.S., there are space programs that are managed by the Air Force, by DARPA, and so these can be very secretive, definitely. But a large part of the space program in the U.S. is managed by NASA, and NASA undeniably has been very good at being extremely transparent and just sharing everything it's doing. And so we're used to this level of transparency, I think, as a space observer. And on the other hand, China's state-owned enterprises don't have this culture of everything and all the time. And an example is, for example, when China landed on Mars recently, so that was in May 2021. Everyone heard of China's Mars mission, and they landed a rover on Mars. And so basically the lander landed and there was no news during several weeks. And so that's unimaginable. I would not see NASA doing that at all. There would be regular communications on what is going on and what they're trying to do, and what's the status of the Mars lander and rover. And so that's just one example of how China prefers to communicate periodically rather than continuously. So when you're not communicating, observers can think, oh, but maybe because this program is handled by the military, so they're not really allowed to communicate on the details. So I think that is one of the possible reasons. Another reason why people think that the space industry is dominated by the military in China is, and this to some extent, I mean, it's true. It's that the ground segment, and so the ground segment, I'm talking about the network of ground stations that are communicating with satellites, exchanging telemetry and tracking information. This, again, to a significant extent, is managed by the military, by an entity that's called CLTC. So CLTC it's an entity that's part of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and also all the launch sites are managed by the military. So you have 4 launch sites in China. You have Wenchang, Xichang, Taiyuan, and Zhouquan, and all 4 of these are managed by the military. So a lot of space infrastructure is indeed in the domain of the military. Now, I think saying that everything is military, that is definitely an overstatement. And a good way that's to look at this, and this is something that's mentioned in a great book on Chinese space, just called China and Space by Brian Harvey, is that you can count the number of satellites that are purely military and that are launched every year by China. You realize that payloads that are purely military in China, they represent 20 to 30% of launches at maximum. And so you have 70%, at least 70% of all the other payloads that are being launched that are, maybe part of China's, space sciences payload. It could be space exploration. It could be building the space station that they're currently building in low Earth orbit. It could be Earth observation satellites. It can be many, many, many things. And so that figure alone shows that there is, it's only part of the military, is definitely only a small, non-negligible, but a small part of the Chinese space program. And there is definitely some hysteria from some space observers on overstating the importance of the military. And just to give an example, and I'll hand it back to you. China launched a space station a couple of months ago. So the Tianhe core module, that was in April 2021. And this space station had a robotic arm. So it's an arm that's articulated and that can help taikonauts, astronauts, perform various tasks when they are outside the spacecraft. It can also perform maintenance tasks. It can also help incoming spacecraft dock. So it's a very useful robotic arm. And this has become a classic in terms of space stations. If we take the International Space Station, for example, it also has a very similar robotic arm that performs similar tasks, right? So on paper, nothing special. But there were observers, and there was also, I think it was the Space Command in the US that accused China of having a robotic arm as a weapon. And so, that is typically, I think, an example of this massive hysteria that you can see sometimes of basically seeing the military behind every single Chinese little piece of equipment that's in China's space program. And yeah, I think that covers it pretty much.
Lately, we have been hearing a lot of news about China's lunar and Mars programs. Can you give us update on them, please?
Yeah. This has definitely been a very hot topic in recent months. So in terms of programs, I'll start with the lunar program because it's the oldest program. And so China has been interested for many, many years in the moon. When it started taking any actual substantial measures to explore the moon, this started in the early 2000s. And this led to the very first Chinese lunar mission called Chang'e-1, and this took place in 2007. And so basically the Chinese put an orbiter around the moon, and this orbiter mapped the surface of the moon. And I just want to add also, it's called Chang'e. All the lunar missions in China are called Chang'e because Chang'e is a lunar goddess in Chinese mythology. So you have Chang'e 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And so far, China has completed 5 lunar missions. So you have Chang'e 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So Chang'e 1 and Chang'e 2 were orbiters. So it's basically sending a space probe to orbit around the moon and to image, to map the surface. Then we had Chang'e 3 and 4, which were lander and rover missions. So the spacecraft was sent from Earth by China and would land on the moon and would deposit a rover. And this rover is called, so for Chang'e 3, it was called U2, and for Chang'e 4, it was called U22. And so these rovers have been roaming on the moon and doing space sciences directly from there. And actually U22, the second rover, so from Chang'e 4, is still active today. And the final mission that they've done so far is Chang'e 5. This was all over the news, so probably our listeners have heard a little bit of it. So it was a sample return mission. And so it's basically landing on the moon. It's scooping up basically a little bit of lunar regolith, lunar soil, and then bringing it back to the Earth, which is definitely a very complicated mission profile. So that's Chang'e 5. And then we have Chang'e 6, which will happen in the coming 2-3 years, which is also a lunar sample return mission. And then we have Chang'e 7 and 8, which are more sophisticated missions that are targeting, they're missions that are targeting more sophisticated technologies on the moon, notably in situ resources utilization. And so what is in situ resources utilization? So for your listeners that are not necessarily very familiar in space exploration, China plans to establish a lunar base. And if we want to establish a permanent lunar base on the moon, but it's the same thing on Mars or just elsewhere in space, we will not be able to send everything from Earth because it's just not sustainable in terms of a cost of launch, and there's just such a massive needs in terms of various resources. And so in order to have a permanent base, well, first of all, you have to have a strong level of recycling technology to reuse the water and the air that you're breathing. But also you have to be able to use local resources. And so an example would be, potentially building the lunar base with lunar regolith, with lunar soil. It could be, for example, taking the ice that's on the south pole of the moon because ice is water, and water can be turned into hydrogen and oxygen. And so hydrogen and oxygen typically are a fuel and an oxidizer for a rocket. And oxygen is also something that us humans can breathe. Water is also something that humans can consume. And so these are technologies that have to be explored in order to establish a permanent base. And that will very likely be one of the key focuses of the Chang'e 7 and 8 missions that should take place sometime between 2025 and 2030. And after the 2030s, China has a program called the ILRS. It stands for the International Lunar Research Center. And this is actually a project that's done in collaboration with Russia. And so there are several steps in this lunar station. The first one would be mainly managed by robots, because sending humans is much more complex. But starting from 2035, we could have potentially more regular and even permanent human presence in this lunar base. So that is China's plans for lunar exploration. It is definitely a very ambitious plan, and it is a sort of an alternative. It presents itself as an alternative to the U.S. Artemis program, which is the U.S.-led lunar program that I'm sure that a lot of people have heard of as well. So that's for the moon. If we talk a little bit about Mars, China has some experience with Mars. It's much more recent. China first had a failed experience in the early 2010s. It was in collaboration with Russia. And so they decided after that to develop their own indigenous Martian mission. And so this was called the Tianwen-1 mission. It was launched towards Mars last summer, and it reached Mars early this year. And it's what I mentioned earlier, the lander and the rover performed a landing on Mars in May 2021. And so this is a very ambitious program. China also has, so by doing this Tianwen-1 mission, China became the second country ever to successfully land on the Martian surface. And they are also planning a Martian sample return mission, probably in the late 2020s, with the sample returning to Earth in the early 2030s. All this has yet to be confirmed, but that is sort of the timeline that we're getting when we're reading in between the lines and connecting the dots.
Jane, when we come to relation and collaborative confrontational, will relation with other space powers be collaborative or confrontational? Or are these business opportunities for foreign space companies in China, Chinese space companies in international markets?
So first, I want to say that relations have been both collaborative and confrontational. And I mentioned earlier, the strong stance that the U.S. started taking against China in the 1990s in the space industry. So the confrontational is definitely coming from there. Still today, you have very strong export restrictions. So a lot of companies are not able to sell into China because there are export restrictions. And even when a company is legally allowed to sell into China, let's say I'm a European company. I have a component that is not subject to export restrictions. I may actually choose not to sell to China because I have a lot of customers in the U.S. and so I have a big customer base in North America, and I don't want to jeopardize this by developing the Chinese market, because this can raise suspicions in the U.S. I could potentially lose a big market. So I'd say that companies that have a big market in the U.S., they could sort of restrict themselves from investing in collaborating with China. And now, if we talk about state programs, space exploration, and space sciences, the U.S. is not allowed to collaborate with China. There's something called the Wolf Amendment, and so this was an amendment that was promulgated by the U.S. Congress in 2011. And basically what it says is that NASA is not allowed to collaborate directly with China's space ecosystem. And so that's the confrontational. Now let's talk about some of the more positive notes, because everything is not necessarily doom and gloom. For example, Europe, the European Space Agency, and the national agencies in in Europe have various countries of Europe have strong collaborations with China. There are, notably in space sciences, there are a lot of Chinese, European, several space sciences programs, so that they have been quite successful. And we also know that well, China's space exploration programs like the Chang'e missions, they are known to have hosted a number of European payloads as well. And we know that Europe is also interested in collaborating with China for, well, have shown an interest at the very least in China's ILRS lunar base program, as well as China's space station in low Earth orbit. So with Europe, things look a little better. Now, if we talk now more about an industrial standpoint, is it confrontational? Is it collaborative? I think to a large extent, it's hard to answer this question because it depends on the subvertical. If we're looking at more, the upstream of the industry, so manufacturing, if we're talking about large systems, probably not great because of the export restrictions. If we're talking about subcomponents, maybe things look a little better. And notably, taking the case of Europe, a number of European companies are known to sell various RF, mechanical, electrical, optical subsystems components to China. So there has been some collaboration there. Now, if we look towards the future, I think there's an interesting trend, which is the expansion, the growth of the new space sector that we've been talking about just now. So this commercial wave of startups, growing and getting into the space industry. And I think one of the trends here is that these companies, they tend to be startups, they tend to be small. And when you're small, maybe you're not like a huge company like Thales or Airbus, or maybe you can go more easily into China than a large company that has maybe some sensitive business units, and for that reason will not want to develop the Chinese market. There's also the fact that some of these startups, one of the trends of new space is using non-space grade equipment and materials and components, and so by doing that, this means that some of these export restrictions drop, and so these new space companies potentially they will be able to collaborate within and outside of China more easily. And the last point I want to say also is that in terms of quality, in terms of sophistication, these new space companies in China are also doing better and better and are growing very fast. So traditionally, when we're talking about collaboration with China, people think of Western space companies, maybe Europe, Japan, the US, these companies selling into China. But possibly we could have the opposite trend. We could have Chinese companies, Chinese commercial companies start selling their systems to foreign countries. And this has already been happening to some extent, but this could definitely expand. So probably won't be directly to the US or to Japan or to Europe, although this could be the case. It will be more, Belt and Road countries and sort of countries that are more reachable within China's sphere of influence. But collaboration could be outbound. It's not just inbound collaboration between Chinese and foreign companies.
I think we have time for one more question, an important question. How does space play a role in China's rising in power, and what kind of role space can play?
So space plays an important role. I divide this into two answers. First area is it plays a role in confirming China's importance as a military power, because as mentioned during some of those questions we discussed earlier, China has the space technology is dual use, right? And so China has a strong level of sophistication in terms of rockets, in terms of missiles, in terms of they've been sending so many Earth observation satellites, both military and civil, over the past. So definitely, I think their strong mastery of the space industry makes them a very important player in from a military standpoint. And we know that space infrastructure will play an increasingly important role in warfare. We know that potentially if there is a large-scale war, during the very first few seconds of the war, the very first thing that that both countries are going to, that two countries that are in war are going to do is try to deactivate or to to interfere with their opponent's space infrastructure. So space is playing a very important role in modern military warfare, and so China's strong position there makes it an important player. So that's from a military standpoint. Now, the space industry also plays an important role in terms of soft power, in terms of prestige for China, and this is notably for the case for its space exploration programs, because this is space exploration is something that's easily understandable by the common people, by it's very attractive. I mean, it's easily understandable. Right? They're exploring the moon, they're exploring Mars, and China has accomplished already several unprecedented things, several world firsts, for example, landing a spacecraft for the first time on the far side of the moon. That is a world first. It's also accomplished a number of seconds. So seconds in the sense that it's the second country, so the only other country after the US to have accomplished a number of things, as mentioned, landing on Mars successfully. And also space exploration gives prestige because not a lot of other countries are pursuing space exploration. It needs sophisticated technology, it also needs a significant budget behind this. And so if we take the example of Europe has sophisticated space technology, but it doesn't necessarily have the ambition and the budget to fuel all the different space exploration projects that currently China has. So I think there's this soft power factor for sure, and I think that also I think space also has a role plays a role in the Chinese narrative of China being a responsible international player, because in the space industry, in the space sector, China tends to go through the United Nations Outer Space Activities Office, UNOOSA, for various of its initiatives, for example, the ILRS. And so, it goes through the United Nations. China is open to cooperate with any country on the planet. So that's sort of the message that they put out. On the other hand, they sort of sell the U.S. as a country that does not go through the UN. The Artemis lunar program does not go through the United Nations Outer Space Affairs Office, and yeah, so it sells the United States a very U.S. centered space power that collaborates only with its traditional allies, and so I think that's also another important thing that, an important factor to promote the Chinese as a responsible player, as opposed to a U.S. centric U.S. centric United States.
Thank you very much, Jane. I think that was the perfect end of a wonderful conversation about the Chinese space history. I'm really grateful for having you as my guest today. I'm also thanks to the fellows who are watching us until the end of the show. Please don't forget to subscribe to my channel for next live shows about the Asia and Pacific affairs. Jean, thank you very much again for explaining a great with your experience about the China's history, history of Chinese space.
Thank you very much for having me, Lokman.
See you in the next program.
Bye.
Bye.